Hi everybody, my name is Guru Banavar. I am the Chief Technology Officer of Viome, and I wanted to take some of the questions that you've posted on the Facebook group and also give you some broader context of what is going on at Viome. I hope some of you, hopefully many of you actually, have had a chance to see the talk I gave at Exponential Medicine this morning. And I wanted to provide a little bit of context around many of the points I made at that talk. Viome has obviously a commercial product, which is the gut intelligence product. At the same time, we also have a number of research efforts, or think of them as R&D efforts, that are developing new potential products. But first, we get the science down, and that takes quite a bit of time for us to develop the science, develop everything from the lab technologies and the analytical technologies, the data technologies, before we can turn something into a real commercial product. So this morning when I talked about a number of the results that we've obtained, I was mostly referring to the research work that we do at Viome. So for example, I talked about how we can predict age as an example. And we can predict age right now with your microbiome data. So just by looking at all the genes that are expressed in your gut microbiome, we can predict how old you're likely to be within, and we've seen that it already performs pretty accurately, state-of-the-art level, and it gives you an answer in the range of about a decade or maybe less, 8.5 years or so. Now I also mentioned during my talk this morning that we have data from the host blood transcriptome, and that is an R&D kit at the moment. And we've deployed that in multiple studies, clinical studies and clinical trials that we're doing with many partners around the world. And when we get the data back from those studies, we analyze it and we also perform some of these analytical experiments that I was talking about this morning. So just wanted to make that clear that there's a pipeline of R&D activities all the way from developing new kits, developing new analytics, and developing a lot of clinical studies and trials that can help us prove and get evidence for the efficacy of certain interventions, the ability for us to pick up on the signals in the microbiome and other sites and other kinds of omics data that we get. And all of that is part of what I spend my day doing pretty much every day. So that takes me to the questions that are on the Facebook page. So there's a couple of very interesting questions here. One of them is about whether, so it says here that it would be nice to read about insights into some of the broader results and trends Viome sees, perhaps in the form of a regular blog posting. I want to say that we've been thinking exactly about that already now for a few months, and I would love to start an area on our website, on the blog site, to talk about some of the results that we see in these R&D experiments that we do. For example, we are currently working on probably about 12 or 15 clinical studies. They're with different partners. Some of the partners are in the locations where we have Viome offices. Like for example, I have, my office and our group is in New York. We have a number of partners in the New York area with whom we are doing clinical trials and clinical studies in the areas of autism, as an example. We're doing other studies in the area of cancers, some other studies in the area of inflammatory diseases of various kinds. So when we make progress with these studies, it would indeed be great to put down some of our early insights, even before publishing the results. I'd be very happy to put down some of those early insights in the form of a blog posting. So I will definitely take up that initiative, and I'll work with my colleagues like Helene over here. Hi. to get some of these blogs out to all of you. Thank you very much for that question. The second question here is, I know Viome does not currently diagnose, but do you ever foresee a day when that might change? I absolutely do. There are many possible avenues that Viome is considering. As you very well know, the path that we're on right now is to have a wellness product that gives you food recommendations and supplement recommendations. One of the outcomes of the studies that we're doing right now could very well be a diagnostic product. Whether it's a pure diagnostic or a companion diagnostic, there can very easily be, for example, this morning I talked about irritable bowel syndrome, and we know that there is a pretty strong signal for IBS in the microbiome, the gut microbiome data. So it's very much possible for us to think about a diagnostic at some point. This is not right now because it requires a number of additional steps. It is quite possible that we can turn our IBS machine learned model into a diagnostic. In order to truly make it a diagnostic, there's a number of validations that need to be done. So remember that the models that we've built so far using Viome customer data will need to be validated through a sort of a clinical prospective analysis, which basically means that we will have to have a sort of a gold standard kind of a clinical test to compare the results of our machine learned models. And once that test comes out or the validation comes out favorably, we can turn a model into a more formal diagnostic. Now, it can also be, depending on what kind of claims we want to make, there may also be some regulatory paths that we need to adhere to. And once we do that, like for example an FDA test or FDA application, but once we do that, we can definitely consider putting it out there for a kind of a diagnostic type of a product. But these are all at this point in time just possibilities, and of course we're going to keep exploring which specific conditions and which specific models meet all the tests and the requirements for diagnostics before we ever do it. Just one last thing I want to mention about diagnostics is the idea of a companion diagnostic. So you may already know that a pretty classic standard of care, such as a chemotherapy in a cancer setting, is very needy or amenable to a companion diagnostic. What that basically means is it's possible that a particular microbiome pattern will allow a particular therapy to be more effective for a specific disease. For example, a specific chemotherapy could be appropriate out of the many possible cocktails. A specific cocktail might be more appropriate for a particular individual based on their microbiome. So we might consider doing that kind of a companion diagnostic and use that along with all the standard therapies and standard of care that's already available in the market. So that was kind of the broad view that we're taking for all the research and development activities we're doing in Viome. So let's see, are there other questions here that I should look at? Maybe yes. The DNA one? Yeah. Just a quick one. So here is a question that says, suppose some of us had DNA tested through services like 23andMe. Is there any way that the data can be plugged into the AI to provide additional insights? Yes and no. So there's an advantage to doing the very specific metatranscriptomic technologies that we are currently using in Viome, and that is that we understand what is the specific activity or expression of various pathways in your microbiome that's going on. So that is obviously an RNA type of technique. It's not a DNA technique, so that is definitely something that we continue to develop, and we will continue to provide as a sort of a differentiator and a more, I would call it actually a more effective way of understanding what's going on in your microbiome, because it's the RNA. The DNA is not necessarily that useful, because all it tells us is what is the potential, or what is the predisposition you have for a specific disease. So for example, you might say that there is a predisposition for a disease like Alzheimer's. If you have a particular mutation in a gene called APOE, there could be a potential for Alzheimer's, but until that gene gets expressed, and that expression may only happen because of environmental or dietary or lifestyle factors, until that happens, Alzheimer's may never manifest itself in your particular case. So the DNA is kind of limited value for that purpose. However, knowing what the possibilities are in terms of the expression of or knowing what the possibilities are from your DNA, from your genome, so that we can validate that the expression in your, for example, the blood transcriptome that we see, to make sure that it corresponds to your genome, would definitely be a good validation point. So I would welcome getting 23andMe data at some point in the future, and I'm definitely going to see if we can make it possible for people to provide their DNA data, so we could run some of these tests and validations before we decide that these are truly useful for our analysis. So that's the best I can say right now about 23andMe and other kinds of DNA data. Is there any other question?
The role of AI in the recommendations.
Okay, cool. So there is a very common question that we get about the role of AI in our recommendations currently. And let me just take a crack at that. AI is a very broad set of tools, and there are two major categories of tools in AI that we use in our recommendations today. There's one category of tools that's known as knowledge representation and reasoning, and that is used heavily in our recommendations today. And the way it works is we take expert knowledge that comes from the literature, the scientific literature, as well as experience of many professionals that we work with, and encode them into a form that a software program can understand, and that's known as knowledge representation. And then there are reasoning modules, which are algorithms that can go over the knowledge representation and make sense out of it and come up with ways of resolving conflicts and figuring out what's the best way to recommend foods, for example, or supplements to an individual based on their microbiome pathways or on their phenotypes, meaning their symptoms and other things that they've already mentioned in their medical history, for example. So that whole set of algorithms is known as knowledge representation and reasoning, and we use that heavily in our AI recommendations today. There's a second class of algorithms known as machine learning, which a lot of you would have heard about as well. We also use that pretty significantly and centrally in our recommendations today. If you heard my talk this morning, I provided the example of predicting glycemic response. That is a machine learned model. It's definitely a core AI module, software module or algorithm. that we use in our recommendations today. So in some sense, what happens in our recommendation engine is the first thing that it determines is what are the likely glycemic responses of our list of foods for you as an individual. And once we determine what the glycemic responses are, then we apply all of this knowledge representation and reasoning that I talked about earlier. That takes into account your microbiome pathway activity, your answers to questions and everything else, and puts it all together in a form that can be given to you sort of in an integrative fashion to maximize your wellness. Taking into account all the scores that you see in the app, taking into account all of the symptoms that you mentioned in your questionnaires, and ultimately we hope that you feel better through the recommendations, and we do our best through the AI algorithms to identify only those foods that are ideal for you to be in your superfood list, and those foods that we know are going to be not good for you given your current microbiome and your symptoms in the avoid food extreme of the range. So we follow these principles of do no harm. So we always want to make sure that that we are conservative and give you things that we are confident about that will not harm you, and we also look for maximizing your wellness parameters as determined by our algorithm. So those are two things we do for giving you the best possible recommendations today using our AI algorithms.
Possible future tests.
So one of the other questions that I hear about a lot are what kinds of new tests we could be introducing into the market in the future. Now, this morning in my talk, I mentioned a couple of tests that were in R&D phase, where we are testing the lab process as well as the analytical methods that we want to use, and that was kind of like a giveaway about what is on our pipeline for the future. So the very first kit that is in our pipeline is the blood transcriptomic kit. So remember that microbiome is constantly interacting with the host, with you, with your human cells, to have a kind of a dance, which is the human cells are kind of creating an environment for the microbiome. The microbiome is generating a lot of metabolites and other kinds of compounds that's consumed or absorbed by your human cells. So there's that continuous interaction. So we want to understand what are the human molecular factors that impact your health. And in order to do that, we are currently testing, and we will probably introduce a product that will be through a finger prick blood test, where you collect a small amount tiny amount actually of blood that we will analyze for the transcript, meaning the RNA in your blood. And as I said this morning, the amount of data that we see from that is approximately, I think it was 13,000 or 14,000 transcripts per sample. That's what we're seeing in our R&D test right now. And that gives us a very good idea of what are the, let's say the inflammatory pathways or the, let's say metabolic pathways, what kinds of sort of, toxicity fighting pathways that are available in your transcriptome or your express genes in your blood at this point in time. So once we get that, we will incorporate a whole bunch of new scores, and we will also incorporate that into the recommendations as well. And that's probably going to refine and make your recommendations even more personalized and even more efficacious for your wellness. So that's one. The other one that we are currently going through an R&D process is the oral microbiome. So as you know, your mouth is a very active and a rich microbiome space. There's a lot of factors in your oral microbiome that impact your health. There's been studies that show that the way your oral microbiome functions can determine whether you have a good, cardiovascular health or not. Our own study that I talked about this morning has shown that we can determine oral cancer. We can essentially diagnose oral cancer by looking at your oral microbiome. So those are the kinds of things that we can do with an oral microbiome test. Meaning, this is a saliva sample. It's very, very non-invasive, and it's very easy for somebody to do at home. You'd essentially spit into a little tube, and it's just about 100 microliters of saliva is what we need. And when it comes to the lab, we can look at what are the organisms in there, and we should be able to determine a number of health factors from that. When we get around to commercializing it, it's still very much in the R&D phase, and it's probably going to be several months before we can get it out to market. So those are the two that are on the pipeline.
Data security.
Security? Okay, so another common question that we hear is how does Viome secure the data that we obtain from you, and how do we manage the privacy of that data, confidentiality of that data? So first of all, Viome takes your privacy and confidentiality and security very seriously. We have put together an IT infrastructure that is state-of-the-art in terms of security and privacy. We have addressed all the security requirements and the privacy requirements that come from a sort of a standard HIPAA type of a platform. We have also separated out the personally identifiable information and personal health information in different places, so the two never mix. And any data that is used for analysis cannot be identified as a particular individual's data. It's essentially anonymized to the point where the analyst is not able to identify which specific individual this data belongs to. And there's very, very few people who have kind of signed in blood about the privacy and confidentiality of the data that end up getting to see the personally identifiable information. So that provides a level of privacy and confidentiality for your data. Have also that is essentially industry standard. The last thing I'll mention here is that we also support GDPR standards, which is that if you don't want your data to be stored, if you're a European citizen, all you have to do is request that the data be deleted, and we have put in place a process for deleting that data as soon as you make the request. So that's GDPR compliant. So we have taken into account all of these privacy, security, and confidentiality requirements in our IT infrastructure. I hope that makes you feel better about our data management practices. Thank you very much. Until next time.